From Chicago to the Vatican, the unbelievable journey of Pope Leo XIV. Chicago in the 1950s was a city of steel and smoke, a place where the cold winds swept off Lake Michigan, where the clang of factories and the hum of bustling streets filled the air. It was a city of working-class dreams and quiet faith, where churches rose above the crowded neighborhoods like beacons of hope. And it was here, in this city of grit and grace, that Robert Francis Prevost was born. Robert's parents were humble, hard-working immigrants, devout Catholics who filled their tiny home with warmth and prayer. His mother, Maria, would light a candle each morning at St. Agnes Church, whispering prayers for her family, while his father, Miguel, worked long hours at the steel mill, his hands scarred but his heart steadfast. They believed in hard work, in kindness, and most of all, in faith. And they passed that faith on to their son. Robert was a quiet boy, but there was something in his eyes, a spark, a gentle strength that seemed beyond his years. He was the boy who helped the old man next door carry his groceries, the boy who knelt for hours in the cool, shadowed silence of the church, his lips moving in whispered prayers. But even as a child, Robert was curious. He would ask his mother, "Why do we pray, Mama? What does God want from us?" Maria would smile, brushing her fingers through his thick, dark hair. "God wants us to love, my son, to care for those who have nothing, to be a light in the darkness." Those words stayed with Robert, a quiet flame that grew as he did. As a teenager, he was a star student, bright, thoughtful, with a gentle smile that put even the most troubled souls at ease. But his true love was the church. While his friends played ball in the crowded streets, Robert would be at St. Agnes, serving as an altar boy, listening to the sermons with a rapt attention that seemed almost otherworldly. Father O'Malley, the grizzled old priest who had served at St. Agnes for decades, took a special interest in Robert. He saw something in the boy, something rare. "Young Robert," he would say, his voice a gravelly whisper, "you have a light in you, a light that this world needs. Have you ever thought of the priesthood?" Robert would smile, his cheeks flushing. "Sometimes, Father, but I don't know if I'm worthy." Father O'Malley chuckled, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "None of us are worthy, lad. But that is why we serve. To try. To give of ourselves, even if we are not perfect." Those words were a seed, planted deep in Robert's heart. And as the years passed, that seed grew. At the age of 18, Robert made a decision that would change his life forever. He told his parents of his calling, his desire to become a priest. His father, Miguel, was silent, his weathered hands clasped together, but Maria's eyes shone with tears. "My son, you will serve God. You will be a light." But the path to the priesthood was not an easy one. Robert entered the seminary, a place of quiet study, of strict discipline. But even there, he stood out, not just for his sharp mind, but for his kindness. He was the young seminarian who would spend hours in the cold confessional, listening to the whispered fears of the faithful, the young man who would share his meager food with the poor who lingered outside the church gates. But it was not enough to simply serve. Robert wanted to learn. He studied theology, philosophy, the history of the church. He spoke fluent Spanish, the language of his mother's prayers, but he also learned Latin, Italian, and French. His superiors saw his brilliance, his gentle strength, and they knew he was destined for more. And then came the call, a call that would change his life forever. The Augustinians, an ancient order known for their work in missions, needed young priests, men who would travel to the farthest corners of the world, who would bring the light of faith to those in darkness. Robert's heart pounded as he read the letter. A mission to Peru, a land of mountains and jungles, of ancient ruins and suffering souls. "Will you go, Robert?" Father O'Malley asked, his old eyes sharp and bright. "Will you leave this place, this city you love, to serve those you have never met?" Robert's answer was a quiet, steady whisper. "Yes, Father. If it is God's will, I will go." And so, Robert Prevost left the bustling streets of Chicago, the warmth of his family, the familiar shadows of St. Agnes, and stepped onto a ship bound for a land he had never seen. The journey was long, the sea a vast, endless gray. But even as the cold wind whipped at his face, Robert stood on the deck, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart a quiet, burning flame. In the mountains of Peru, he would find a world of beauty and suffering, a place where the faithful whispered ancient prayers, where poverty and illness were shadows that never left. But he would also find a new family, souls in need of hope, of healing, of a light in the darkness. And it was there, in those quiet, hidden villages, that Robert would become more than a priest. He would become a shepherd who would one day become a pope. The mountains of Peru were a world of shadows and light. Mist clung to the jagged peaks like a shroud, and the narrow, winding paths were lined with ancient stones, whispered legends, and quiet suffering. It was here, in the cold embrace of the Andes, that Robert Prevost first understood the true meaning of faith. He arrived in a tiny village called San Pedro, a place forgotten by time. The mud brick houses were crumbling, the fields were dry and cracked, and the people were thin, their faces lined with hardship. But when Robert stepped into the small, crumbling chapel at the heart of the village, he felt something, a quiet, fierce light that flickered in the eyes of the faithful. "Padre!" a child's voice cried, and a dozen tiny hands reached out to him. They were thin, dirty, but their smiles were bright. Robert knelt, his face a gentle smile. "Hello, my children. What is your name?" "Pedro," a boy with wild black hair shouted, his grin missing a few teeth. "And this is Maria, and that is Jose." Robert's laughter was a warm, rich sound, and the children laughed with him. But beyond their joy, Robert saw the shadows, the gaunt faces of the mothers who watched from the doorways, the old men who whispered of lost crops, of sickness that came with the rains. Father Miguel, the old Augustinian priest who had served in San Pedro for decades, watched Robert with weary eyes. "You have a kind heart, young Robert," he whispered, his voice a thin, trembling breath. "But kindness is not enough in this place. The people need more." "I will help them, Father," Robert whispered, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I will teach them. I will bring them hope." But hope was a fragile thing in San Pedro. The fields were dying, the crops withered beneath the relentless sun. Illness swept through the village like a shadow, leaving children pale and weak, their tiny breaths shallow and rasping. Robert walked among them, his gentle hands bringing comfort, his prayers a soft, steady whisper. But there were days when his heart broke beneath the weight of suffering. "Why does God allow this?" a young mother sobbed, her thin arms clutching her feverish child. "Why does he let our children suffer?" Robert's voice was calm, but his heart ached. God does not wish suffering upon us. But in this world, there is darkness, and we are called to be the light. But light was hard to find in the darkness of San Pedro. Robert learned to dig irrigation channels with the villagers, his hands raw and blistered. He learned to tend the sick, to mix herbal medicines with the village healers, to pray over tiny, still bodies, his tears falling like rain. Yet even in the suffering, there was a light. The people came to know him, not as a distant priest, but as a brother. The children would run to him, their laughter bright even in the shadow of hunger. The old men would sit with him in the dusty plaza, sharing stories of the ancient days, of the Inca kings who once ruled these mountains. Father Miguel, his voice a faint, rasping whisper, would watch from the chapel doorway. "You are a light, Robert," he whispered one night, his frail hand resting on Robert's shoulder. "But even a light can be snuffed out. You must be strong, for they will lean on you." And lean on him they did. When the rains finally came, flooding the dry fields, Robert led the villagers in digging ditches, guiding the waters to save the crops. When a fever swept through the village, he walked from house to house, his gentle voice bringing comfort, his prayers a balm for the suffering. But it was not just San Pedro. Word of the young priest spread, and soon villages from the distant valleys sent for him. He would ride on a tired, thin mule, his worn robes fluttering in the mountain wind, his heart a quiet, fierce flame. In each village, he would find the same suffering: hunger, sickness, despair. But he would also find the same light: the quiet faith of the poor, the gentle strength of the forgotten. And it was in those quiet, hidden places that Robert became something more. The people called him Padre Roberto, a name whispered with love, with hope. They would bring him their sick children, their dying elders, and though he could not always save them, he never turned away. He became not just a priest, but a shepherd, a man who walked with the poor, who bore their burdens, who gave them light. Years passed, and Robert's hair grew silver, his face lined with the mountain wind, but his spirit remained fierce. The Augustinian order recognized his brilliance, his quiet strength. He became a leader, a teacher, a guide for young priests who came to Peru, men who spoke of faith, but who learned what it meant to live it. And then, one cold, gray morning, a letter arrived, a letter sealed with the crest of Rome. Robert's hands trembled as he opened it, his heart pounding. A call from the Vatican, a summons to return. The church needed him. "Will you leave us, Padre?" a young girl whispered, her tiny hand clutching his robe. "Will you forget us?" Robert knelt, his gentle hands resting on her shoulders. "No, Maria, I will never forget you. You are my family, and I will always pray for you." But in his heart, Robert knew this was not just a journey. It was a calling. A call to serve not just a village, but the church itself. A call that would take him from the quiet mountains of Peru to the grand shadowed halls of the Vatican. A place where faith was a weapon, where ambition was a poison. As he stepped onto the narrow mountain trail, his robes fluttering in the cold wind, Robert looked back at San Pedro, the tiny chapel, the smiling children, the mountains rising like silent guardians. He whispered a prayer, his voice a quiet breath. "Lord, give me strength. Let me be a light." The journey to Rome was long, the sea of vast, endless gray. But even as the cold wind whipped at his face, Robert stood on the deck, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart a quiet, burning flame. For he was not just Robert Prevost, the boy from Chicago. He was Padre Roberto, the shepherd of the mountains. And soon he would be something more. Rome was a world of shadows and whispers, a city of marble palaces and ancient cathedrals, but also a place where faith and power danced a dangerous dance. When Robert Prevost stepped off the ship, his worn robes fluttering in the cold wind, he felt the weight of history pressing down. He was no longer Padre Roberto of the Peruvian mountains. Here, he was just another priest, a pawn in the vast, glittering maze of the Vatican. But Robert was no ordinary priest. His quiet strength, his fierce compassion, and his brilliance soon drew attention. He became an advisor, a teacher, a voice of calm in the turbulent halls of the Vatican. Bishops whispered of his wisdom, young priests sought his guidance, and even the cardinals saw in him a man who carried the light of faith. But light was a dangerous thing in Rome. The Vatican was a palace of secrets, a place where ambition wore the mask of holiness where bishops plotted in the shadows, where whispers could be as deadly as daggers. Robert saw it all: the whispered deals, the hidden betrayals, the endless struggle for power. But he did not waver. Even when the Augustinian order called him to serve as their leader, a position of great power, but also great danger, Robert accepted with quiet humility. "We serve not for glory, but for God," he would whisper to his brothers. "We serve to be a light." But his light could not be hidden. His wisdom, his strength, his kindness shone even in the darkness of the Vatican. And soon, Rome took notice. Pope Francis, a man known for his humility, saw in Robert a kindred spirit. He made him a bishop, then a cardinal, placing him at the heart of the Church's most powerful councils. But power brought enemies. There were those who whispered against him, who saw him as a threat. "He is too humble," they sneered, "too honest. Rome is not a place for saints." But Robert was not afraid. Even in the shadowed halls of the Vatican, he remained the shepherd of the mountains, a man who listened to the poor, who comforted the suffering, who spoke of faith without fear. And when Pope Francis passed and the conclave gathered to choose a new leader, it was Robert's name that echoed through the grand hall. A quiet man from Chicago, who had become a light in the mountains, who had walked among the poor, who had stood against the shadows of Rome. The cardinals whispered his name, their voices trembling with awe. And when the white smoke rose above St. Peter's Basilica, the world learned his new name: Pope Leo XIV. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang out, their deep, thunderous echo sweeping across Rome. Crowds filled the Grand Plaza, their faces turned upward, eyes wide with hope, with awe. The white smoke curled into the sky, a signal seen around the world. A new pope had been chosen. But within the shadowed halls of the Vatican, beneath the golden ceilings and the painted saints, Robert Francis Prevost stood alone. "Pope Leo XIV," whispered Cardinal Rainier, his voice trembling with reverence. "The world awaits you." But Robert, now Pope Leo XIV, stood silent, his gaze fixed on the ancient cross that towered above the altar. His heart pounded, a quiet storm within his chest. He was no longer the boy from Chicago, no longer Padre Roberto of the Peruvian mountains. He was the shepherd of the universal church, the voice of faith for over 1 billion souls. A roar echoed from the plaza, the distant chant of "Viva il Papa." But even as the crowd cheered, shadows lurked within the sacred halls. For the Vatican was not just a place of faith, it was a palace of power. And Pope Leo XIV was no stranger to its darkness. He stepped out onto the grand balcony, the light blinding, the sea of faces stretching to the horizon. His voice was calm, his words gentle. "Brothers and sisters, peace be with you." His voice echoed over the crowd, a quiet strength that seemed to reach every soul. But even as he smiled, even as his voice calmed the faithful, he saw them, the figures in the shadows, the faces that watched him with cold, calculating eyes. The curia, the cardinals who whispered in the darkness, who wielded power like a weapon. Some had supported him, others had whispered against him, but all now bowed before him. Yet Leo knew the truth. In Rome, even a bow could hide a dagger. His first days as pope were a whirlwind. Letters of congratulations from kings, from presidents, from the faithful of every nation. But also whispers of crisis. Scandals that threatened the church, financial chaos within the Vatican Bank, bishops accused of sins that stained their sacred robes. Pope Leo XIV did not hesitate. He called the curia together, his voice calm but sharp. "We are shepherds, not kings. We are servants, not rulers. And the light of faith cannot be hidden behind shadows." Some whispered that he was too bold, too direct. Others saw in him a man who would cleanse the church, who would bring light to its darkest corners. But Leo was not a man of empty words. He ordered an audit of the Vatican's finances, revealing corruption that had been hidden for decades. Priests who abused their power were stripped of their robes, bishops who covered for them were removed, and even those who whispered against him found their influence slipping. But the more light he brought, the more shadows he revealed. A council of cardinals came to him, their faces pale, their voices sharp. "Holy Father, your reforms are dangerous. They are causing division." "Division?" Leo's voice was a calm whisper, but his gaze was fierce. "The truth divides only those who live in shadows. We are the church, a beacon of faith. If we fear the light, then we are already lost. But the faithful are confused. The world watches." "We must show unity," one insisted, his voice desperate. "Unity in what?" Leo whispered, his voice cold. "Unity in lies? Unity in corruption? We will be united in truth, or we will not be united at all." But even as he spoke, he saw it. The flicker of fear in their eyes, the whisper of conspiracy that lingered in the shadows. The Curia was an ancient beast, a palace of power that had survived kings and wars, and even a pope could become its prey. But Leo was not afraid. Even in the shadowed halls of the Vatican, he was still Padre Roberto, the shepherd who walked among the poor, who comforted the suffering. He spoke not with the voice of a king, but with the quiet strength of a man who had seen suffering, who had knelt in the mud beside the dying, who had whispered prayers in the cold mountain winds. And the world saw it. The faithful whispered of him as a saint, a man who spoke of faith without fear, who touched the sick with his own hands, who knelt in the rain with the homeless. He walked through the slums of Rome, blessing the children who ran to him, listening to the stories of mothers who struggled to feed their families. But his light cast shadows. There were those who whispered of him as a threat, cardinals who feared his reforms, bishops who saw their power slipping. And beyond the walls of Rome, kings and presidents who wondered if this new pope would challenge them, if he would speak against their cruelty, their corruption. Yet Leo did not waver. He spoke of peace, but also of justice. He preached of love, but also of truth. And in the grand halls of the Vatican, he walked as a humble man, a shepherd among the wolves. One cold night, as rain lashed against the windows of his private study, a letter was slipped beneath his door. No name, no seal, just a single sentence written in sharp, cold ink. "Even light can be snuffed out." Leo read the words, his face calm, his hands steady. He had walked among the dying, he had buried children in the mountains of Peru, he had knelt beside the forgotten. Fear was a shadow he had long since conquered. He stepped out onto the darkened balcony, the rain washing over him, the city of Rome spread out beneath him like a sea of shadows and light. And he whispered a quiet prayer, his voice a steady flame. "Lord, if it is your will, let me be a light, even in the darkness." But even as he prayed, the shadows within the Vatican whispered. His reforms, his truth, his light, all had made him powerful enemies. Enemies who smiled before him but plotted behind his back. Enemies who saw in him not a shepherd, but a threat. The election of Pope Leo XIV marked a historic moment in the annals of the Catholic Church. On May 8, 2025, Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, a 69-year-old native of Chicago, was elected as the 267th Pope, becoming the first American-born pontiff in the nearly 2,000-year history of the Church. The conclave, a solemn and secretive gathering of 133 cardinal electors, convened in the Sistine Chapel following the death of Pope Francis on April 21, 2025. After 4 rounds of voting over 2 days, the white smoke billowed from the chapel's chimney, signaling the election of a new pope. Cardinal Dominique Mamberti announced the news to the world with the traditional Habemus Papam, revealing that Cardinal Prevost had chosen the name Leo XIV. Pope Leo XIV's election was seen as a continuation of Pope Francis's legacy, emphasizing social justice, care for the marginalized, and a commitment to global unity. His extensive experience as a missionary in Peru and his role as the prefect of the dicastery for bishops provided him with a unique perspective on the Universal Church's needs. In his first public address from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo XIV greeted the faithful with the words, "Peace be with all of you." He expressed gratitude for the legacy of his predecessor and called for unity and compassion among all people. His choice of the name Leo XIV pays homage to Pope Leo XIII, known for his advocacy of workers' rights and social teachings. The new pope's election has been met with widespread acclaim, with leaders from around the world sending their congratulations. His dual citizenship in the United States and Peru symbolizes a bridge between cultures and a commitment to inclusivity within the Church. A message to our subscribers. The story of Pope Leo XIV is a testament to humility, service, and unwavering faith. From his humble beginnings in Chicago to his missionary work in Peru, and now as the leader of the Catholic Church, his journey inspires us all. We invite you to reflect on this historic moment and share your thoughts. What does the election of the first American Pope mean to you? How do you envision Pope Leo XIV shaping the future of the Church? What lessons can we learn from his life dedicated to service and compassion? Please leave your comments below. Your insights enrich our community and foster meaningful discussions. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like and share it with others. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that delve into the lives of remarkable individuals who shape our world.